unprecedented force in response to the travesty and brutality of Putin's war against Ukraine. The most powerful sanctions to date have blocked Russia's largest financial institutions and its central bank from the global financial system. I commend President Biden and Secretary Yellen for their leadership in coordinating these efforts with our allies. In support of these efforts, I recently sent a letter to the trade associations representing our nation's financial institutions, asking them to report how U.S. businesses are doing their part to exit Russia and block funding for Putin's war on crimes. So I look forward to their fulsome responses. The utility of our allies in helping Ukraine did not occur by accident. The unity, that is. In fact, this unity is a direct result of the Biden administration's efforts to renew the U.S. commitment to global economic cooperation. President Biden signaled this commitment last year with his first budget proposal when boosted U.S. contributions to the multilateral development banks, global climate finance efforts, and food insecurity programs by 73%. This was followed by Secretary Yellen's support for a new allocation of special drawing rights at the International Monetary Fund, which provided $275 billion liquidity boost to emerging economies to help them respond to the global pandemic. There will also be a new test of the strength of the international financial system and its international financial institutions, which will center on the ability and willingness of Western nations to adequately respond to the humanitarian, energy, security, and food insecurity crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. But our work is not done. This committee recently marked up legislation to further isolate Russia and support Ukraine, including my bill, the Nowhere to Hide Oligarchs Asset Act, that assists FinCEN in identifying the yachts, the luxury apartments, and other assets of Putin's cronies. We will continue to keep the pressure on Putin. Additionally, my committee intends to pay close attention to the challenges faced in the Caribbean, including a lack of access to international banking services. So I want to see a concerted effort by international financial institutions to focus on the Caribbean and show the world that development is possible even under the most challenging circumstances. So, Secretary Yellen, I look forward to your testimony. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for appearing before the committee. It's been a long time coming. I know Democrats control the House and the Senate and the White House, but our expectation is that the Treasury Secretary comply with the law and appear before our committee and other committees as the law dictates. So we're grateful you're here. But this is long overdue, especially considering the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and also what we note on Capitol Hill, that the Chinese government is taking notes, especially to the U.S. response in this conflict. The Biden administration's sanctions have helped isolate the Russian economy. That's good, but it was reactive at best. We watched as Russia amassed troops at the border last fall, all the while claiming no plans for invasion, a claim parroted by Chinese officials as late as February 23rd even. And at the same time, all of this is happening with Russia and Ukraine, we see China's continued activities in the Taiwan Straits, and they're telling us that supporting Taiwan is, quote, dangerous, end quote, to our relationship. We must remain clear-eyed about who we're dealing with here. China must feel the pinch of its no-limit partnership with Russia. While the Biden administration eventually sanctioned Russia, it also unwittingly provided a means by which China could help Russia circumvent those sanctions. Let me explain. Last year, the Treasury Department bypassed Congress and approved a general allocation of International Monetary Fund special drawing rights, SDRs, sending Russia and Belarus more than $18 billion in de facto $18 billion in no-strings-attached liquidity. State sponsors of terrorism like Iran and Syria receive billions more, by the way. Republicans warn that an SDR allocation ran counter to U.S. sanctions policy. As the Putin regime continues its assault on Ukraine, it is clear our concerns were justified. And yet even OFAC seeks to block Russia's access to foreign reserves. At the same time, our country allowed SDRs to become a lifeline that the Russians may exchange for Chinese currency, for the Chinese RMB. Now, U.S. officials have to ask foreign countries not to redeem the very same Russia SDRs this administration pushed for just a few months ago. This policy doesn't make any sense. That was a bad decision. And I think it's important that the public recognize, and this administration recognize, that Congress is a partner in this fight, this international fight that we have. It is the Treasury Department that has a duty to keep us informed. To date, we have yet to receive certain reports related to the international financial institutions under your remit. This includes policies regarding China, Taiwan, and efforts against terrorism financing generally. I appreciate the Treasury's work in terrorism and financial intelligence. It's good work. But here, too, the Treasury must respect the oversight of Congress, and it's simply unacceptable that Treasury officials have dodged public hearings for as long as they have. We have to work to ensure that we have maximum pressure on Moscow so that the Putin regime changes course in Ukraine. But at the same time, we cannot keep our eye off the challenge that China poses and the risks that a rising China poses to the stability of the world. So, Secretary Yellen, thank you for being here. And with that, Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member McHenry. I now recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Secretary, welcome over here, Siberia. I've been in dozens of these hearings with at least 4 secretaries of the Treasury. I can't remember a hearing in which our cooperation and unified action were more necessary. As we speak, Russian troops are raping women, they're murdering military-aged men, and they're targeting children in Ukraine. I don't think anyone in this room will ever forget the images that we saw of Russian barbarism in Bucha. So our mission is clear. Democrats and Republicans, legislature and executive, we must do all we can to help Ukraine win this war. We must show the Russian people that the nation of Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky will be completely isolated with a Stone Age economy as long as they are governed by a butcher. And whether it takes 1 year or 10, Vladimir Putin must answer to the laws and the standards of decency that he mocks. So I have just one question today, which is, what more can we do to help the people of Ukraine and the survival of our democracy?
I now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for 1 minute.
Secretary Yellen, thanks for being back with us, and I just want to compliment my friend from Connecticut. I couldn't say it better myself. I will say one thing we could do more is to sanction the energy-related transactions, which we are not doing. Russia's war in Ukraine highlights the important role of the Office of Foreign Asset Control within Treasury to put economic pressure on Putin and the Russian military. U.S. sanctions, coordinated with our allies, have had some effect, but we can do more, as I said. The atrocities on display, especially in recent days, necessitate that the U.S. use its full sanctions power, including comprehensively limiting Russia's ability to profit from oil and gas sales. We are not sanctioning energy-related transactions. We need to do so now. The IMF is also at a crossroads. The fund plays an important role in promoting international macroeconomic stability, yet scandals at the top of the organization and its mission creep into issues like climate change create a lack of confidence in its leadership. This hearing will focus on Treasury's representation of U.S. interests at IFIs, and I look forward to today's testimony.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome the Honorable Janet Yellen, Secretary of the United States Department of the Treasury. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. You will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. You should be able to see a timer that will indicate how much time you have left on your testimony. Secretary Yellen, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee, Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm here to discuss Treasury's oversight of the international financial institutions, or IFIs, and our role in promoting inclusive and sustainable growth, global monetary and financial stability, and development. Over the last 2 years, the IFIs have led the way in helping low-income and developing countries fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the beginning of the crisis, the IMF has approved nearly $175 billion in emergency lending, concessional financing, debt service relief, and precautionary support to fund pandemic response and economic recovery efforts. The multilateral development banks, or MDBs, approved nearly $130 billion over the same period to address the health, economic, and social impacts of the pandemic. Treasury's pressed the World Bank to work with international partners to improve vaccine readiness and support increased vaccine delivery in developing countries. As long as this pandemic is raging anywhere in the world, the American people will be vulnerable to new variants. The importance of the IFIs is even more paramount given Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Russia's actions, including the atrocities committed against the innocent Ukrainians in Bucha, are reprehensible, represent an unacceptable affront to the rules-based global order, and will have enormous economic repercussions in Ukraine and beyond. Treasury is committed to holding Russia accountable for its actions, so it cannot benefit from the international financial system. President Biden has rallied over 30 countries, representing well over half the world's economy, to impose swift, severe sanctions and export controls on Russia. Treasury is also working with our partners to block Russia from accessing benefits from the international financial institutions. Both the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development had ceased approving new financing for Russia since the unlawful annexation of Crimea in 2014. Since the invasion, these institutions have announced further measures to prevent Russia's and Belarus's access to financial and non-financial assistance. Since the start of the war, rapid IMF and World Bank assistance has allowed Ukraine fiscal space to pay salaries for civilians, soldiers, doctors, and nurses, while also meeting its external debt obligations. The IMF, World Bank, and EBRD will be critical partners in rebuilding Ukraine, and they will also provide vital support to neighboring countries welcoming refugees. Spillovers from the crisis are heightening economic vulnerabilities in many countries that are already facing higher debt burdens and limited policy options as they recover from COVID-19. The IFIs will play a critical role in several areas. First, food security. Together, Russia and Ukraine account for nearly a third of the world's wheat exports. Russia's invasion disrupted the flow of food for millions of people around the world and caused prices to spike. The IFIs and food security funds are already working to address both the short-term and long-term effects of the invasion on global food prices and supplies. Second, energy security. The invasion of Ukraine has also underscored the need for sustainable, affordable, clean, and secure energy for economic growth and security for the United States, as well as for governments that partner with the IFIs. The MDB's promotion of energy efficiency and capital investment toward diverse energy sources like solar, wind, and other non-fossil fuel-based energy sources, and away from suppliers such as Russia, that strengthens energy security and reduces short-term fossil fuel price risks, all while addressing the long-term threat of climate change. Public finance alone cannot meet this challenge, So Treasury is encouraging the MDBs to undertake reforms and adopt more ambitious targets for mobilizing private capital, particularly through their private sector windows. Many low-income countries are facing growing debt burdens as the pandemic continues into a third year. The IFIs supported the G20's debt service suspension initiative from 2020 to 2021, which helped eligible countries free up resources to use toward pandemic support. The IMF and World Bank are now supporting the Common Framework for Debt Treatments, which seeks to help low-income countries address their longer-term debt-related vulnerabilities. The recent record replenishment of the World Bank's concessional window, the International Development Association, will help deliver critical financing to the world's poorest and most vulnerable to address these impacts at a moment of urgent need. Finally, the Biden administration is seeking congressional authorization to provide financing to bolster the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, the IMF's existing concessional facility, and the new IMF Resilience and Sustainability Trust. The PRGT has been stretched by the exceptional amount of COVID-19 financing provided and needs additional funding. The new RST will provide targeted financing alongside IMF programs to support countries' efforts to strengthen energy security and pandemic preparedness. I look forward to working with you to continue to advance U.S. economic leadership abroad and create opportunities for Americans at home. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And while you will probably get a lot of questions today about Ukraine, this is an international financial architecture that we're looking at. And for years, I've been concerned about how our Caribbean neighbors are treated in the international community by U.S. financial institutions and by our own government. In particular, I'm concerned that as a result of United States government actions and overly cautious U.S. banks, countries like Barbados, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and others have been cut off from access to capital and credit. De-risking, as this issue is called, has direct and negative effects on the ability for the Caribbean to build businesses, employ citizens, facilitate economic development, and allow families to send and receive funds from abroad. De-risking has consequences for the United States as well. The Caribbean region is both geographically and historically close to the United States, and it is not only an important trading partner, but also a strong, reliable ally in security cooperation. This is why this committee passed legislation which was signed into law through the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020 that directs the Treasury to lead a government-wide strategy on de-risking and provide that strategy to Congress later this year. Madam Secretary, can you speak to the importance of the Caribbean region to the United States and what the Treasury is doing to address de-risking, including Treasury's progress on the strategy?
Thank you for that question, Chair Waters. Financial inclusion, of course, is a very important goal of the United States and the Treasury Department, and we have been concerned about de-risking in the Caribbean and other areas of the world. I would say that in spite of that, the United States has one of the lowest costs of sending remittances of any country in the world, and we have seen remittances increase considerably. The data that we have on the Caribbean shows that there have been a significant increase in remittances there and to Latin America more generally. There are diverse drivers of de-risking. One issue is profitability concerns of banks that have led them to cut back. also changes in global business strategy following the 2009-10 financial crisis. Our AML-CFT rules may be a further contributor to de-risking, and to the extent that that's true, we think the best way forward is for jurisdictions to make meaningful and publicly visible improvements to their AML-CFT regimes. That's something that will give foreign financial institutions confidence that they're operating in an environment in which they can mitigate the risks effectively. And Treasury is happy to engage in dialogues and provide support to jurisdictions that are seeking to make those changes.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I yield. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, who is the ranking member of the committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Yellen, thank you for being here. As we know, Russia is still earning hundreds of millions of dollars each day in hard currency through its oil and gas exports. Even though the president banned Russian oil imports, which I welcome, Treasury continues to provide sanctions licensing for banks transacting in transactions related to Russian energy. This includes financial services allowing other countries to import Russian oil and gas. Why are these licenses being provided?
So we are working very closely with our partners to have a coordinated set of sanctions. And our goal from the outset has been to impose maximum pain on Russia while, to the best of our ability, shielding the United States and our partners of undue economic harm.
I've publicly commended the administration's approach on sanctions. What I'm particularly asking about are the licenses permitting bank transactions related to Russian energy.
Well, in following up what I just indicated, unfortunately, many of our European partners remain heavily dependent on Russian natural gas as well as oil. And they are committed to making the transition away from that dependence as rapid as possible. We're doing all we can to help. But in the meantime, we issued this license, and they have taken steps to make sure that there can be a continued flow of Russian natural gas and oil.
And if the Europeans take stronger action against Russian energy, your department would take stronger action as well.
Well, we're working closely with them on sanctions and want to remain aligned with them.
So I want to pivot to China because I think the government of China is watching us very closely. It's pretty clear that when Russian troops amassed on the eastern Ukraine border last fall, the administration lacked a cohesive strategy to respond. Many of us have warned that a similar situation is occurring between China and Taiwan. Now, for example, Chairman Xi has vowed to, quote, smash, end quote, any attempts at independence by Taiwan. We've seen an unprecedented incursion by the Chinese into Taiwanese airspace, including sending dozens of planes into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Has the administration issued a warning of sanctions or a threat of sanctions to Beijing to deter military action by China against Taiwan?
So clearly the administration and the Treasury Department are opposed to any unilateral change in the status quo with respect to Taiwan. And we are working very closely with our partners in the administration to make sure that we have at our disposal tools to respond to provocations in that regard. I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals and what we would do in any particular scenario, but I will assure you that we are closely coordinating with all of our interagency partners to make sure that we will be able to respond appropriately.
Has the administration contemplated a sanctions strategy in the event of a Chinese move against Taiwan?
I'm not going to comment on specifics. We have put sanctions in China in place on China with respect to forced labor in Xinjiang and provocations with Hong Kong. But certainly we are concerned about Taiwan and will act as appropriate.
And that would include, including sanctioning senior leaders of the Chinese government, as has been done with Russia and Russian oligarchs. Are you to say, am I to hear from you that you're open to all tools available in the event that China moves aggressively towards Taiwan?
Absolutely. I believe we've shown that we can. In the case of Russia, we threatened significant consequences. We've imposed significant consequences. And I think that you should not doubt our ability and resolve to do the same in other situations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, who is also the chair of the House Committee on Small Business, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Yellen, many of us on this committee are concerned about the potential use of cryptocurrencies and other digital assets to evade international sanctions imposed on Russia for its illegal invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. and other G7 nations recently pledged to work together to ensure the Russian state, its elites, and oligarchs will not be able to utilize digital assets to sidestep these sanctions. How is the Treasury Department working to carry out this pledge?
Well, we are concerned about sanctions avoidance, and we recognize that digital assets present opportunities for doing exactly that. So first, I would say that we're monitoring for any attempts to use cryptocurrency to evade our sanctions, and we have ample enforcement authority which we won't hesitate to use. We are tracking carefully, using all the tools at our disposal, the assets of oligarchs and other sanctioned individuals. We're working very closely, exchanging information on this with our partners in the so-called repo task force. The Department of Justice announced a new task force called Klepto Capture, which is designed to use U.S. law enforcement resources to identify and prosecute sanctions evasion. And FinCEN issued an alert to financial institutions to help them recognize suspicious transactions in this regard.
Thank you for that answer. Secretary Yellen, I want to commend the Treasury Department on yesterday's announcement sanctioning the virtual currency exchange Garnatex and Hydra, Russia's most prominent darknet market. On the one hand, I think this announcement demonstrates the concern I have about how the dark web and cryptocurrencies can be utilized for illicit and criminal behavior, and that cyber criminals operating in Russia often operate with support of Vladimir Putin and his regime, but more importantly, sends a message to Putin and cyber criminals around the world that the United States, in coordination with its allies, will continue to disrupt these networks and cut off all avenues for potential sanctions evasion by Russia. My next question, Secretary Yellen, is one of the many tragedies of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine is the refugee crisis it has created. The United Nations estimates 500,000 Ukrainians have already fled, and early estimates suggested that refugee totals could reach up to 4 million. Support for Ukrainian refugees could cost hosting states as much as $30 billion over the next year, according to some estimates. How is the Treasury Department working to assess and possibly alleviate the economic and financial impact the refugee crisis is having in other countries in the region.
Thank you for that. We're very concerned about the refugee crisis. We are monitoring this situation very carefully and recognize the enormous burden that it's going to place on host governments that are already struggling with other stresses because of the pandemic and their proximity to the conflict. So we're working with other agencies and also with international partners to support the host governments and the refugees themselves. And there'll be a variety of channels: bilateral support, multilateral support. We're working with the international financial institutions, and as an example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development recently announced a $2 billion Euro package to support Ukraine and other afflicted countries, but this will be a high priority for us.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Secretary Yellen, thank you for joining us today. Last month, I introduced the Isolate Russian Government Officials Act to ensure that Russia becomes a pariah in certain international organizations. I was very pleased to see the committee pass this legislation unanimously in March. Could you please reply, with a simple yes or no, unless you feel the need to elaborate, regarding Russia's involvement with the following groups that are within Treasury's jurisdiction? Secretary Yellen, should Russia be removed from the G20?
So President Biden's made it clear, and I certainly agree with him, that it cannot be business as usual for Russia in any of the financial institutions. He's asked that Russia be removed from the G20, yes. And I've made clear to my colleagues in Indonesia that we will not be participating in a number of meetings if the Russians are
Good,
there.
and I'm going to go down a few others, because this is all codified now in my legislation that I hope will make it to the floor. So I'm pleased to hear you are echoing the position of the administration and certainly of this legislation vis-a-vis the G20. Should Russia be removed from the Financial Action Task Force?
That's one that I haven't looked into. I'll get back to you on that one, but its role certainly should be minimal.
Please do, as it is, again, part of this legislation. The media reported last month that Russia had, quote, stepped back from participating in the Financial Stability Board, FSB, but it is still listed as a member. Should Russia be removed from the FSB?
Well, certainly its role should be minimal.
Well, I would hope it would be removed from the FSB, and this is what this legislation does, that passed unanimously out of committee. I will hope that the administration, and I believe that that it has indicated such.
These are not unilateral decisions of the United States, and each one of these organizations has its own set of membership.
But we need to make a strong stance ourselves as leaders in these organizations.
We've made clear that we do not want Russia to participate actively in these organizations.
So that would be the FSB. Later this month, the IMF and World Bank will hold their spring meetings. Will Russia be represented at those meetings, even virtually? And will you urge participants to refuse interacting with Russian officials?
Well, Russia is a member of the IMF, and in spite of the fact that the great majority of IMF members, I think, agree that Russia's actions are horrific, it doesn't look like it would be possible, given the rules, to remove Russia's...
I understand that, but what I'm saying is the U.S. must lead and be strong in our resolve on these sanctions and in making them the pariah in these organizations. So I'd hope that you would urge participants to refuse interacting with Russian officials vis-a-vis the IMF and World Bank.
We will denounce Russia's actions in all of these fora.
Thank you very, very much. Moving on to China. As you know, China has faced major challenges in its real estate sector, including debt problems at one of its largest developers, Evergrande. China's opaque lending abroad creates contingent liabilities of unknown size, and Chinese regulators have warned about a rise in non-performing loans. Beijing has also announced restrictions on private investment in news media, which would only tighten the Chinese Communist Party's control over information and make China's economy more opaque. In your view, Madam Secretary, which parts of the Chinese financial system pose the greatest risk to stability beyond China's borders? And what is Treasury doing in the FSOC, the Financial Stability Board, and elsewhere to mitigate this risk?
Well, I do think that there is significant risks in the Chinese financial system, and the property sector is an example of one where there are severe risks. And importantly, a slowdown in the property sector beyond its global implications would probably weigh on China's growth outlook, which would have impacts on its economic partners. And this is something we're carefully monitoring.
If you have any other information on that, I'd appreciate it in writing. We can follow up. I'll yield back to the chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, who is also the chair of the House Agricultural Committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Chair Yellen, you and the Treasury Department have refused to sanction Russian oligarch Alisher Usmanin, who is worth $20 billion, and who is also Vladimir Putin's favorite oligarch. And I want to know why. Why would the U.S. Treasury Department issue a special license exempting this oligarch and making it legal for his entities to continue doing business as usual with our American companies when Putin is murdering children, bombing hospitals, raping children, raping women? Why?
So we have sanctioned a large number of Russian oligarchs.
But my question is this. There's got to be a reason. We need to get answers to this. The international world is wondering why. And there's got to be a reason. With the terrible deeds, the criminal crimes that this administration is taking. And here you got Putin's favorite oligarch, worth $20 billion, being exempted and given the right to continue doing business. Answer me, please.
Well, I can't.
The world wants to know.
I can't give you the details on a specific individual, but I can tell you that every day we continue to impose additional sanctions. This morning we announced just 15 minutes ago a further set of sanctions, including on Putin's children.
Yeah, but
and, sometimes beyond blocking an individual, when an individual owns companies, has an interest in companies, it's important.
Well, let me ask you this. My time is marching on. Tell me about your Office of Foreign Assets Control. What role did they play in this decision?
They play an important role in preparing sanctions packages against individuals.
Chair Allen, this is serious here. This is becoming a black mark on our nation. We need an answer as to why. You may have a legitimate one. If it's the Office of Foreign Control, we need to know. If it had some desperate situation in which to do otherwise would impact our own nation or our security, why?
We work very closely with the State Department and the National Security Council in deciding on sanctions packages.
Was there any internal disagreement within the Treasury's Department Office of Foreign Assets Control about how certain oligarchs would be protected from the deep economic impact on these sanctions? Why Putin's number one oligarch? That sends a false image of what we're doing. And let me tell you, our reputation as the world leader is at stake when these types of things are happening and there's no explanation for it. So help us with that.
I'm not going to offer comments on a specific individual that we haven't sanctioned.
Have you have you refused to sanction others, key oligarchs? Is there a pecking order?
We have imposed a large number of sanctions on Russian oligarchs and continue to impose further ones. We're not finished.
The gentleman's time has expired. Madam Chair, I would ask that you make arrangements with Mr. Scott. If it's classified, you may meet with him, whomever you designate, but he needs an answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair
Lady.
Lady.
From Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Yellen, I'd like to discuss with you today a significant concern for me. The U.S. economy is facing significant challenges. We're coming off the heels of a global pandemic that we're still studying the effects of. The U.S. economy is also experiencing supply chain backlogs and inflation at a 40-year high, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine exacerbates economic uncertainty. In Oklahoma, small businesses, farmers, ranchers are navigating surging gas prices and volatile agricultural markets for inputs like grain and fertilizer. In these uncertain times, investors seek to protect their retirement savings, to hedge risk, and of course, safeguard their businesses. As I'm sure you can appreciate, providing liquid markets to protect the U.S. economy in the face of substantial headwinds should be a priority. Unfortunately, I'm concerned about the volume and significance of rulemaking proposals coming out of the Securities and Exchange Commission in such a short amount of time runs counter to this goal. Since November, the SEC has proposed over 20 new major far-reaching rule changes. These rules impact every asset class under the SEC's jurisdiction. The sheer amount and complexity of these rulemakings, compounded with the short and simultaneous comment periods, and I note that short and in many cases simultaneous comment periods, could negatively impact markets and the public that depends on them. It's important for Congress to be able to fully understand the impact and potential unintended consequences of the SEC sweeping new proposals. So here's my question, Secretary. Can you speak to the importance of market liquidity during times of massive economic uncertainty?
Well, certainly having liquid markets is extremely important to businesses and consumers to be able to engage in financial and hedging transactions that they count on to deal with risk. So I certainly agree with the idea that that should be and is an important priority.
And I realize you're not on the SEC, but the current approach, I worry, could rattle markets by rolling out extensive proposals during a time when strong capital markets are just essential to our constituents, economic growth, and national security. Second question, Secretary. News reports suggest the administration is preparing to impose a new round of sanctions on Russia following recent atrocities, including two of Russia's largest financial institutions. The European Union is also said to be preparing new sanctions. In your discussions with your international counterparts, could you speak to the urgency in which the EU plans to intensify Russian sanctions, particularly focusing on a ban on Russian coal, oil, and natural gas exports?
I think our partners are outraged by the atrocities that are being committed in Russia, as we are, and we are working very actively with them to impose new sanctions that will cause Russia significant pain. This morning, we announced our own sanctions package that will now fully block Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, from participating in the U.S. financial system, as well as their largest private bank, Alpha Bank. The president will sign a new executive order prohibiting new investment in Russia by all U.S. persons, and additional sanctions have been placed on elites and some state-owned enterprises. And Europe is also working at a rapid pace to announce additional sanctions. I'm not going to try to tell you exactly what they are, but there's certainly intend to add to the sanctions they have in place.
Absolutely, Secretary, but you don't see a reluctance on their part to target Russian energy exports, do you? Or change in that reluctance?
They recognize clearly the importance of depriving Russia of export revenue to the maximum extent that they possibly can, but regrettably have dependence on oil and natural gas. So there are trade-offs there that they're trying to manage as best they can.
With that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Secretary, thank you very much for all of the many things that you are trying to accomplish and the good things that you've done. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of the President, Madam Secretary. He has, in my opinion, brought the world together, for the most part, to take on the invasion of Ukraine. And I think that's a significant accomplishment. I still have faith in the President, and I compliment him for his ability to not only pull people together, but to try to maintain this coalition so that if this becomes a long-term endeavor, we will still have allies with us. I think that's important. Now, Madam Secretary, I have a copy of your statement for the record, and it indicates as long as the pandemic is raging anywhere in the world, the American people will still be vulnerable to new variants. I believe this to be a truthful statement and correct. As you know, Hong Kong is having some concerns with the virus that are causing great lockdowns, millions of people involved. And as you also know, the Senate had a deal for $10 billion. That $10 billion deal appears to be stalled. I see where you have encouraged the World Bank to continue working closely with COVAX and the international partners to improve vaccine readiness and to support increased vaccine delivery to developing countries. Have you weighed in with the Senate, Madam Secretary? This is pretty important for us to get this deal done. Would you kindly give a response?
Well, my colleagues in the White House have definitely weighed in. They regard the provision of additional funding to deal with the pandemic to be a critical priority, and are very concerned that we lack the funds that we need to address COVID. So they are very focused on this and have weighed in fully on the importance of this legislation.
Just a follow-up, I do appreciate weighing in. This is not only about the United States, it's about the world. As you know, the deal is void of emoluments for the rest of the world, just the United States. And now that is being held up.
Yes.
I think as we weigh in, and I'm sure you're doing this, expand it to make sure we include the rest of the world. I appreciate the $10 billion deal, but your statement rings true. As long as the pandemic is raging anywhere in the world, the American people will still be vulnerable to new variants. That's important. So can you give me the criticality associated with not only having a deal for the United States, but also the rest of the world?
Well, we absolutely need additional funding to help the rest of the world deal with the pandemic as well. We're continuing to do everything that we can through the WHO, the World Bank, the task force that they've put together, and I think that's right. I would repeat what the words that you quoted me as saying, that as long as the pandemic is raging in any part of the world, the United States is not safe. There will be new variants, and I think it's critically important. I'd also like to add that we have requested funding or the ability to lend funds to the new Resilience and Sustainability Trust that the IMF is establishing. One of the purposes of that trust is to provide the resources for countries around the world, middle and lower income countries, to be prepared for the next pandemic. I wish we could feel that this will be our last, but we should have learned our lessons that the globe needs to be prepared. And I would ask again that Congress provide the authorization that we need to lend resources to the IMF to help them prepare the world for future pandemics.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Secretary Yellen, do you believe cutting the deficit spending and borrowing from the Federal Reserve could make a significant contribution to reducing inflationary pressures?
I apologize, I didn't catch your question. Could you say it again?
Certainly. Do you believe cutting the deficit spending and borrowing from the Federal Reserve could make a significant contribution to the reduction of inflationary pressures?
What about the Federal Reserve? Did something about the Federal Reserve, could you repeat that?
Yes. Do you believe cutting deficit spending, got it?
Cutting deficit spending?
Mr. Posey, would you speak into the microphone and speak up a little bit louder?
Yeah, I think I got it at 100% here. Let me try it again. Okay. Do you believe that cutting deficit spending and borrowing from the Federal Reserve could make a significant contribution to the reduction of inflationary pressures?
The Federal Reserve is charged with controlling inflation and is taking steps to address the inflationary situation here. And the administration has just proposed a budget that has over the next decade $1 trillion worth of deficit reduction. So I agree on the importance of controlling inflation, and the Fed, of course, is independent in making its judgments on what's appropriate, but will take action to help bring inflation down.
So you do believe that cutting deficit spending and borrowing from the Federal Reserve could make a contribution to reducing inflationary pressures?
I think the Fed has a role to play in reducing inflationary pressures, yes.
And you think cutting deficit spending can help?
We have proposed to do so in the budget, the fiscal 23 budget that the administration has just released.
So I take it that's a yes then? The simple answer would be a yes?
Yes, and we do have a substantial reduction in deficits this year. The deficit is coming way down this year.
Taxing unrealized capital gains would increase the present value of taxes on long-term gains, obviously. How will taxing unrealized capital gains impact the size of investment and the allocation of capital among alternative investments?
Generally, tax policy, interest rates all affect the cost of capital, and that is one factor that influences investment. But although in principle the cost of capital should be an important determinant of investment spending, most experience and empirical research suggests that the linkages are not terribly strong. Usually expected future output is more important.
The Ukraine war is teaching us again that energy is a strategic as well as an economic good. In light of that, should we recalibrate the rush to transform the energy economy and increase the contribution of fossil fuels in the short to medium term, say the next 10 to 15 years?
I'm sorry, you asked about fossil fuels and what should we do about fossil fuels?
Yeah,
I think.
You think we should think about recalibrating the rush to transform the economy by eliminating them?
Well, over time, to deal with climate change, we need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and I think our energy security also will be greatly enhanced as we transition to renewables. I think really the only way
do you think we should maybe delay the rush a little bit in the current times that we're in? You know, with energy being such an important force in the Ukraine right now?
Well, the president has proposed using reserves from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and incenting producers to raise, American producers to raise oil production to deal with the short-run crisis we face.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you and the Ranking Member McHenry for this hearing. And Madam Secretary, thank you very kindly for your always candid comments. You know, this reckless and ruthless Russian invasion of the Ukraine has laid bare a number of things. One of them is, at least for me, and I think and millions of other Americans, that we need to desperately move toward creating our own sources of energy, at least as many of them as we can, solar or fossil or biofuels, whatever cellulosic, whatever we can do. Even though I represent Kansas City, Missouri, I represent one half of it. And then I represent little towns like Multi-Bend, people haven't heard of, or Oric. And one of the things that they are talking about is the increase in the cost of fertilizer. Something most Americans would not even remotely consider. But they're talking about the rise in the cost of fertilizer, and the fertilizer, at least 20% of it, I think, or maybe somewhere in that number, comes out of Belarus and Russia. We've got some. I mean, they're having an impact on us right now, and so I'm wondering. I know that there are things the Treasury is doing with the IMF and the World Bank and international financial institutions, IFI. Are there more things that Treasury can do to push us toward a more sustainable nation in terms of energy, at least? I'm concerned that, you know, our politics here in Washington may prevent us from really looking at the fact that there is a global existential threat brought about by climate change, and so I guess we'll have to deal with it on the political stage. But are there things that Treasury is doing or would like to do as it relates to this issue?
So I share your concern about climate change as an existential threat. I think it's one that demands really immediate attention. President Biden has proposed a number of policies that Congress hasn't yet passed that would increase our reliance on renewables, on wind, on solar, on renewables, and help shift us away from fossil fuels. And I think the current situation in global energy markets and the risks that we're experiencing the global economy is due to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine should, if anything, strengthen our resolve to address energy security, to rid ourselves of dependence on a global oil market where dictators in many places really control the price and availability of our energy supplies. And I think moving to away from fossil fuels and toward renewables is critical for our energy security as well as for addressing climate change. So both things should be pushing us heavily in that direction. And I hope that Congress will soon act to, put in place tax incentives for renewables, for electric vehicles, and other aspects of the climate agenda.
Thank you very kindly for your vision. Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Yellen, nice to see you this morning, and I appreciate your being here. As you know, I'm the ranking member on small business, and it's disappointing that we're now at 345 days since you have failed to do your statutory duty by showing up there. Just a quick question, do you intend to show up at all at the Small Business Committee to do your job of reporting on the PPP program?
Your mic.
Microphone, please. Microphone. Madam
Sorry,
Chair, I respect your comment, but let's be honest here. You're required to be in front of small business, and you're not there. You're here this morning, thankfully, that's fine. You go to other committee hearings, but you never show up at that one. I was surprised that the chairman of the committee, Ms. Velasquez, didn't ask you this question, because it's very plain in the law. It says you show up, and you haven't done it. So my question is, do you intend to show up?
Well, I'll have my staff work with yours to discuss it.
That would be fantastic. Thank you. I think it's a repeat of the last question or time we've talked about this, but at least it's a commitment to do something. With regards to the subject we have in front of us this morning, I want to ask you the same question that I asked Chairman Powell the other day, which was, I think this is a very instructive moment from the standpoint that I'm thankful and agree with a lot of the sanctions that you're putting on the Russian economy, the oligarchs, all the other things you're doing. I don't disagree with those things. I think we'd better do that and more. My concern was, or is, that it got done late. We should have had this done instead of being reactive, we should have been proactive. And We knew that the Russians were building 3 hospitals on the Ukrainian border. We knew they were going in, and yet we did nothing until after the fact. So my comment to you, my question to you this morning is, knowing that this was going to happen, we did nothing. We now, I think the ranking member made a comment this morning about China, knowing that they're going to go in. In fact, there's a published report in the newspapers last week that said that China was going to go into Taiwan this fall and decided not to do it. I don't know whether that report is true or not, but it was in the paper, so therefore I think we need to take it seriously. And if that's the case, are you working with the administration? Are you putting plans in place as a Treasury Secretary to come up with some deterrence with sanctions right now before they get in there and not wait till after they invade Taiwan?
Well, look, we told Russia that we would impose very heavy costs on it if it invaded Ukraine. And the purpose was to deter that action. You wouldn't deter the action by putting in place sanctions before
yes, you can, Madam Chair.
something had occurred.
You can do that. When they built the hospitals on the border, you said that's an incendiary action on your part. Therefore, we're going to do this. If you build another one, we're going to do this. If you build another one, we're going to do that. If you invade, we're going to do this. That can be done. There is a way to deter that if it's structured correctly. And my question is, are you thinking about doing this with China? Yes or no?
We are certainly working together in the administration to have in place a wide range of tools and strategies.
Okay. With regards to other actions that are going on right now, Madam Chair, I'm very concerned about a speech that was made recently by one of the members of your FSOC. Do you think financial stability of the United States would be threatened if roughly a quarter of the deposits of the United States were not insured by the FDIC? Do you think it will hurt the financial stability of our country if 25% of the bank deposits in this country were not insured by the FDIC?
So I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I would certainly say that deposit insurance has played a critical role in making runs
I'm sure you would
very
agree,
rare.
Madam Chair. I'm sure you would agree that this is extremely important. The FDIC insurance underpins the stability of our banking economy. If Mr. Stile could just please stand and sit still so I could see the chairman, that'd be great. Thank you. Apologize. Because what happened was Mr. Chopra, and I have his speech right here, made a speech last week in which he made a comment that he thought it was okay to limit access. One of the punitive actions he took or suggested as a result of continued violations by bankers and big banks especially was to limit access to deposit insurance and put banks directly into receivership. Don't take my remarks wrong here. I think if these guys are doing bad things, they need to be punished, they need to be fined, thrown in jail. I don't care. But what you're doing when you undermine the financial system by pulling FDIC insurance, you're hurting the consumers, the customers of those banks, and this is a gentleman who should be worried about consumers. I would hope that you'd be concerned about that.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Beatty, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Waters. And today I'd like to also thank Secretary Yellen for appearing before the committee today. I truly appreciate your leadership as Treasury implements the sanctions against Putin's regime, particularly those as more details of war crimes and atrocities committed in the Ukraine come to light. My question, Madam Secretary, is let me say I welcome your testimony that the international financial institutions will be providing support to refugees to the countries that are welcoming refugees. And this is something that I've been concerned about since the very beginning of the humanitarian crises. As you may know, last month when this committee marked up legislation related to the Ukraine crises and Russian sanctions, I was pleased to have a bipartisan provision added that will address the United States, well, really you, in your capacity as Secretary, to use our position on the IFIs to encourage economic support for refugees including those of African descent, who have been faced with particular hardship. So can you tell me how will the financing made available by the IFIs be used to aid refugees, and how can we assure that these funds are being distributed equitably?
Well, I think that the international financial institutions have a critically important role in helping refugees and helping countries that are hosting refugees. And, you know, we will have meetings of the international financial institutions, the IMF and World Bank, a week after next, and will be involved in active discussions with them about how to fashion programs to make sure that aid is distributed effectively. Bilaterally, we will also be involved in that, and the European Union will as well.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get in two more questions, but while I have you, let me quickly follow up on something that you and I have talked with, and let me just say up front, your staff has worked extremely well with my team in putting Harriet Tubman in her rightful place on the $20 note. But I guess I have a concern, and while I'm thankful for your engagement, I'm not pleased with the timeline that's left out. I realize you inherited a lot. I know before we had been working with your predecessor during the Obama administration, and we thought we had made great headways. And I understand the technical limitations for the security features, the production capacity, and all of that. But I really don't see any reason why the concept and design steps couldn't be moved much faster. Getting the design freeze stage would mean a lot to the people who have been working on this and waiting on this for far too long and too many years. I know this is a problem that you inherited, but the delays made by your predecessor, and I would ask for a commitment for you to move this process along. And I guess that I want to hear today if we could take maybe the part that shows her imaging. We have a piece of legislation, bipartisan, with overwhelming, and I'm going to push it to get to the 200 to sign on this, that we can lock in that stage of the image. If you could take a few seconds and respond.
Well, what I can say is I promise for my own part to do everything I possibly can to expedite this process. And I know that there was no action on it during the previous administration. We're still adhering to the original timeline that was announced. I'm trying to remember when it was first announced. Maybe it was 2014, if I'm not mistaken.
You are correct.
It's a frustratingly time-consuming process, and it involves developing technologically sophisticated security features, new security features, a generation of them.
And I hate to cut you off, but my time is going to expire. So I do want to show that we have an image, and we're going to do legislation to lock in this image and you to support us in that. Thank you, and my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Heisinger, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Secretary Yellen, good to have you back here in person and to see you again. I'm very, very briefly, don't filibuster me on this one, please. But last time you appeared here with Chair Powell, you had claimed you felt inflation was, at that point, transitory. Do you still believe that today?
So,
very short, please.
I think when I use the word transitory, I was thinking that it's related to the pandemic, and that when the pandemic goes away, that will make a big difference.
Do you still believe it's transitory?
That. I believe that the pandemic, unfortunately, has been and will be longer lasting than I anticipated.
So you still, basically you're saying the pandemic is still happening, therefore that's why we're still seeing inflation.
Well, I think that's one of the contributors to it.
Okay. All right. So let me get into the meat of what we need to talk about here about what's happening in international situations. I am pleased, and Madam Chair, thank you for including my legislation in 16 bills that were actually noticed for this hearing today. And I had a bill, the Russian Sovereign Debt Prohibition Act, which was noticed. And this bill would simply prohibit U.S. financial institutions from financing Russian sovereign debt, regardless of the date a bond was issued, extending the Biden administration's current restrictions on new bonds that are being issued. I know that it was supposed to be considered in the March markup. Something happened and somehow it fell off. We have a committee, I think, are trying to do everything we can to tighten those restrictions. And I respectfully ask that the chairwoman include that legislation in the next package of bills that we might consider. Yesterday, I reintroduced another bill that I had previously called the No U.S. Financing for Iran Act, a bill that would effectively prevent U.S. financial institutions from engaging with the government of Iran while prohibiting both the IMF and the Export-Import Bank from providing them financing. Specifically, my bill would prohibit the exchange of special drawing rights, and it's similar to what my colleague Mr. Hill has worked on regarding Russia. Secretary Yellen, can you certify that the Biden administration will oppose the exchange of Iran's SDRs, those special drawing rights, with any country, even if the administration concludes a new nuclear agreement with Tehran?
Well, Iran has not been able to use its special drawing rights. The United States would not exchange SDRs for dollars, nor have our partners. And I don't see that changing.
You commit, okay, so you commit to continuing that.
Well, we'll have to see what happens if they sign a bill, but I have no
That's a different answer than we have no intention to.
There's no change in U.S. policy. We have not been willing to in any way aid Iran in using its SDRs, and I don't envision that changing.
Okay. Well, in Washington Post had an article over the weekend saying that Tehran has demanded that we lift the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps' designation as a foreign terrorist organization. That same article quoted a high-ranking Iranian official who said effectively an agreement to revive the nuclear deal with the U.S. is close. Do you think that's a fair assessment, first of all? And as you know, President Trump had put in that original designation back in 2019. It's still heavily sanctioned, and there has been some enforcement actions, but there's also been some designations that have been lifted. Does the Biden administration continue to believe that the Revolutionary Guard is a foreign terrorist organization?
They are designated as such. There are active negotiations taking place over the JCPOA, but I can't comment on the details of what's happening in those. I don't believe I can or should.
Okay, so you may have that knowledge, but you're not able to share it.
I am not deeply involved in the details of those negotiations.
All right. Have you or anyone else at Treasury been directed to reduce Iranian sanctions enforcement so as to not interfere with those Vienna talks?
We haven't changed our sanctions.
That's not my question. That's not my question. Have you been instructed to or requested to? You may have ignored it. I guess that's what I'm trying to find out.
There's been no change in any administration policy, to the best of my knowledge.
And I'll follow up with some written questions as well. I appreciate that.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for this hearing, and especially I want to thank the Secretary for being here. I appreciate it. Madam Secretary, it sounded like, and I want to apologize, I wasn't here for the whole meeting. I have another hearing that's running at the same time. That happens around here quite a bit, as you know. But it sounded like someone was trying to put words in your mouth about the issue of inflation being transitory or related to the pandemic. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I think a lot of people are starting to forget that we're in a pandemic, and so much of this inflation is tied to that. Could you comment on that, please?
Yes, certainly. So, in part, the inflation represents the impact of supply bottlenecks. For example, a third of the inflation we've had reflects higher prices of new and used cars. And unfortunately, the auto companies are unable to get sufficient semiconductors to produce cars at capacity. So inventories are highly depleted. Cars, both new and used, are in tremendous demand, and their prices have risen. But also we've had enormous demand for goods, for imports, particularly coming from East Asia, that have resulted in higher shipping costs, higher trucking costs. These disturbances, these inflationary developments are pandemic related because we saw enormous shifts away from services and towards goods during the pandemic, a huge increase in the demand for durable goods that strained the capacity of the U.S. and global economies to meet those demands in a timely fashion. And that's what I mean in part by being pandemic related. So we do have a very tight labor market. Core inflation is also quite high. Addressing the pandemic, I believe, will help. The Federal Reserve also has a job to do with respect to inflation.
So, Madam Secretary, I'm a car guy. I collect cars, and I pay attention to the prices of cars. I normally collect old ones, not new ones. But the truth of the matter is you normally don't pay MSRP for a new car. You normally pay below that. That's what you negotiate. But a lot of these cars have been selling above MSRP. And that, again, it's because of the same issue. It's the pandemic. I mean, I think that's what you were saying in layman's terms. I mean, you weren't saying it in layman's terms, but I say it in layman's terms. That's why cars are so damn expensive.
Sure. I mean, inventories of cars are depleted because the American car companies aren't able to produce at their capacity. They just can't get the semiconductors that they need to embody into these cars, and that's because the demand for goods and for technology, technology devices that incorporate semiconductors became so enormous during the pandemic. It takes a long time to increase semiconductor manufacturing capacity. American companies are in the process of doing it, but at the moment, I think if you go to a car lot and try to a dealership, you see almost no inventory available to purchase, and that's why you pay more than MSRP.
That's right. And now I do want to put some words in your mouth, because I believe they are your words. And I think you were saying the war in Ukraine threatens to inflict, and I think this is what you said, enormous economic repercussions. And again, you may have commented already, but I have 30 seconds left. Could you comment on that?
Sure. The sanctions that we've placed on Russia are pushing up the price of energy. We think it's a price that's important to pay to punish Russia for what it's doing in Ukraine, but energy prices are going up. The price of wheat and corn that Russia and Ukraine produce are going up, and metals that play an important industrial role, nickel, titanium, palladium that goes into catalytic converters. The costs of those things are going up, fertilizer, potash, and this is going to escalate inflationary pressures as well.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen, for your testimony right here. Thank you for your testimony. Let me follow up with Ranking Member McHenry's line of questioning about the energy loophole in the sanctions on Russian banks. And I've talked to Deputy Secretary Adeyemo about this, and he's a very impressive guy, and he's open-minded to my line of inquiry. I hope you are as well. I have a bill called the No Energy Revenues for Russian Hostilities Act that would close that loophole or give the administration the option to create an escrow arrangement that requires all Russian energy revenues to be allocated for humanitarian purposes, which is similar to arrangements currently in place with Iran. So to the extent that you have concerns, or the administration has diplomatic concerns or sensitivities with respect to our European allies' overdependence on Russian gas, this legislation or this approach would enable you to retain the ability to waive or license specific transactions to help our European allies get those supplies of gas, but then escrow the proceeds of those transactions and have a carrot approach, not just a stick, but a carrot approach, build up those revenues and say to Putin, withdraw, you get your gas revenues, but only if you withdraw from Ukraine and only if you use these proceeds for humanitarian purposes. Would you be open to that approach?
I think something along those lines is a constructive suggestion, and I think it's an approach that is worth exploring. We have a way for Russia to sell oil and gain the proceeds in the form of a general license, but the license is temporary. It will expire. We need probably a better mechanism. I think it's a constructive suggestion.
Well, thank you. And
we could work with
thank
you.
Thank you. And your deputy, Mr. Adeyemo, was open to that as well. I'd appreciate you all looking at that. Again, it's a bill that I have, No Energy Revenues for Russian Hostilities Act. I think this is the loophole that we need to close. This is what Zelensky is asking for. When he says we need to be tougher on sanctions, this is what he's talking. This is what is financing Putin's war. It is the foreign currency that is being used through these energy transactions. This is what we need to cut off to the extent we can.
I would just emphasize that we need the flexibility to work with our partners on this. This coalition has been critical to our success.
I agree, Secretary.
Not to be unilateral in our approach.
I agree, and I know, and I agree with that. But this bill and this approach would give us that flexibility. It would enable you to provide some of those transactions, allow some of those transactions to go through for our European partners, but build those proceeds up in an escrow account and give an incentive for Putin to withdraw. Let me ask you another question, switching gears here. As someone who served both as chair of the Federal Reserve and now in your capacity as Treasury Secretary, the chair of FSOC, you have a unique view into the regulatory landscape for the financial services industry. And one of the things that I've always wanted to learn more about is how our regulators develop frameworks with international standard-setting bodies. Decisions made at Basel and the FSB are highly impactful to the U.S. economy, and I don't feel like Congress really has any insight or visibility into what the United States advocates for in these negotiations. What types of materials and briefings were you given as Fed chair and now as FSOC chair with respect to what we commit to in these groups? What types of materials can we get for this committee to ensure that the advocacy is in line with the policy goals of the Congress?
Well, we can try to provide you with materials and briefings. The FSB and the BIS publish their work papers on their websites. There's no regulatory enforcement through those agencies there. These are fora in which we discuss with partners around the world what would be desirable regulations, but it doesn't in any way inhibit what we can do or compel us to do anything in the United States. We do what's in our interest, but it's a way to try to have a global system that's coordinated and coherent.
Thank you, Secretary. Yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, who is also the chair of the Task Force on Artificial Intelligence, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Secretary Yellen. Secretary Yellen, I understand that you will be giving a speech tomorrow regarding digital asset regulation. I don't want to force you to reveal any spoilers here. I do want to touch on something that I believe is just at the core of developing any well-regulated digital asset ecosystem, and that is how can participants securely and reliably assert their digital identity, online and offline, with the appropriate controlled anonymity that is being developed in the EU and elsewhere. I was very encouraged that recently Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, Elizabeth Rosenberg, she recently announced that the Treasury planned to make 2022, quote, a year of action for digital identity. There are really a host of reasons why Treasury may be the most appropriate authority to help deploy a secure digital identity framework. I'm also very encouraged that the technical components for a privacy-preserving, you call it a crypto financial driver's license, are actually in place. The mobile ID or digital driver's license that are being rolled out by a number of states are based on interoperable standards originally developed at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and now being adopted by the International Standards Organization around the world. And they've actually been implemented for both iPhones and Android. These allow a modern cell phone to be used as a very high-quality, privacy-preserving biometric second factor that will be absolutely crucial in combating identity fraud and many other online misbehaviors. Your department's work towards combating illicit finance and preventing government benefits fraud, soon as central bank digital currency, would all greatly benefit from an improved and internationally operable digital identity framework. So can you speak a little bit about how Treasury might be well-equipped for such an effort that will really require an extraordinary level of international and interagency cooperation?
So I believe this is a very important initiative. I'm not an expert on the details, but I would say to you that Treasury has very wide-ranging equities in digital identity space. In part because we administer public benefits, tax refunds, and because we have a broader role in the financial system. So we absolutely want to explore how we can develop and implement digital identity solutions that will coordinate across the government. And we're at this point fleshing out actions that we can take to advance this agenda. If you have specific ideas, we would welcome the opportunity to discuss them with you, and I can have my staff give a briefing on what we're thinking about as well, if that would be useful, but like to have the benefit of your thinking on this.
Yeah, and I think that the international collaboration will be essential from the start. I mean, if you're really going to have a central bank digital currency and you need a means of authenticating yourself as a legitimate participant for a central bank digital currency, and you want foreign nationals to participate in your central bank digital currency, you're going to have agreements, at least among the free democracies of the world, as to how this is really going to work. And so I urge you, it seems very much in line with the Biden administration's push towards getting the free democracies of the world to act coherently, to do things like preventing corruption, financial fraud. And this is is going to be really at the heart of this. Let's see, can you say a little bit about the executive order related to crypto that's come out and how you see Treasury's participation going in that?
The executive order related to digital assets?
Correct.
Yes, I mean, the president has asked the agencies, but Treasury plays an important role in assessing the future of money, and that entails the role of digital assets, how we can create an environment in which responsible innovation can flourish, but there's adequate protection of consumers, investors, financial stability concerns, risks of illicit finance. We need a regulatory framework that I think we don't have at this point, and want to make recommendations as to how we can safely do this. Also look at the pros and cons of a central bank digital currency.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And in full disclosure, Madam Secretary, I am a car dealer. There's a lot of conversation going on about my industry. I'd love to talk to you one day about it after COVID, what life is after COVID in the car industry. I also wanted to follow up on Mr. Lueckemeier's question on coming to the Small Business Committee, of which I am also a member. You seem to not answer the question again, and you said you needed to talk to your staff first. I don't understand we need to talk to your staff to attend a meeting you're required to attend. So can you say you will come see us? Okay.
Sorry,
all right. Okay.
Certainly prepared to discuss.
All right. Thank you. You spent the last few months touting a new international tax regime that you have been negotiating with other large economies. And recently, numerous American businesses have raised concerns about some of the details that have started to come to light. Independent experts who have examined the deal found that the U.S. companies are disproportionately negatively impacted, while foreign companies, our competitors, in other words, have negotiated protections for key industries. So lucky for our business community, whatever international agreement you make will ultimately need congressional approval, and you will either need to get the deal classified as a treaty, which would require the approval of 67 senators, or a revenue-generating proposal, which would need to pass both chambers of Congress. So regardless of how the agreement is ultimately classified, you will not be able to follow through on any of your promises without significant buy-in from Congress. And I guarantee you that the support you need to make these drastic changes to international law, tax law do not exist. They're not here in the House or the Senate. So because right now we are hearing from U.S. companies that this deal makes them less competitive. So, Madam Secretary, how will you approve your congressional engagement as these negotiations progress?
Well, we have been engaged throughout over the last several years in briefing on both sides of the aisle, members of the committees about the tax agreement, and have kept people up to date, members of Congress up to date on the negotiations that have taken place in the OECD bill. So-called Pillar 2 is really ready for enactment, and a package that would have met our commitments was in the House-passed reconciliation bill that hasn't progressed in the Senate. But we think that the idea that this harms the competitiveness of American businesses, I really have to push back strongly against this. I think the United States now is the only country in the world that has a minimum global tax, and what this deal does is commit 137 countries around the world to establishing a global minimum tax, which will greatly enhance the competitive position of our firms that are the only ones that face this now. And for the globe, it will stop the race to the bottom in terms of countries lowering their tax rates and leaving countries unable to raise the tax revenues that businesses need us to have to invest in infrastructure and other things that will make our economy competitive.
Just a bit of raising taxes is not a winnable position, I don't think, and that's where I stand, where a lot of people stand. So last week, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco released a study that showed inflation spiked last March after the Democrats forced the American Rescue Plan through Congress. They analyzed the current U.S. inflation rate against other developed economies and concluded that upwards of 3% of the inflation we are experiencing can be attributed to government spending. We know how the government spends. So unfortunately, some people in Congress are trying to revive the Build Back Better Act to spend trillions more dollars in a time when the economy is already overheated. They often cite the same economists who incorrectly claimed inflation was transitory, we talked about that today, as the ones who now say Build Back Better will reduce inflation. So we cannot double down on the reckless government spending and continue to drive up inflation. I can tell you as a small business owner, I know what that's doing to our business. So, Madam Secretary, I have a two-part question real quick. First, who in this country is hurt the most by the inflation? That would be my first question.
Well, consumers are hurt by inflation, and low-income consumers probably bear the biggest burden.
Okay, my time is up, and I give my time back to Chairman.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Secretary, at the beginning of this year, we faced $16 trillion of legacy LIBOR, where the parties would not know how much interest should be paid by the borrower to the lender. We've solved that problem. I want to thank you and your staff for your help in drafting the LIBOR Act, and then I want to thank the other part of your staff for promptly issuing tax regulations to clarify what I think was obvious, but it always deserves clarification when you're dealing with $16 trillion, and that is that there was no sale or exchange as a result of the change in index. The chair of the Small Business Committee brought up in her comments the issue of cryptocurrency and Russians using that to evade our sanctions. I want to commend all members of this committee the bill I've dropped today, the Russia Digital Assets Sanctions Compliance Act, which would give the administration the authority to tell crypto exchanges that they have to shut down all Russian wallets or some portion of Russian wallets. The crypto exchanges have announced that they're going to do business as usual with all those that they believe are Russian citizens or Russian companies unless and until laws are passed that require them to do otherwise. This is in real contrast to so much of the rest of the private sector, which has voluntarily cut off Russia, particularly their oligarchs and government. The ranking member of the full committee brought up the issue of a possible invasion of Taiwan. I look forward to working with him and others on this committee on a bill that would strip China of its most favored nation status or normal trade relationship with the United States automatically should there be an invasion or blockade of Taiwan. We, of course, focus on Ukraine, and I will in a second, but an even greater disaster is occurring in the world, and that is in the Ethiopian region of Tigray, where 500,000 people have been killed. This has been done not only by the Ethiopian government, but the government of Eritrea, which have imposed a blockade that threatens to kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Given the short time, I'm going to ask you to respond for the record. What additional sanctions can we oppose, particularly on Eritrea, which has crossed international border for the purpose of engaging in a coordinated genocide against the people of Tigray? It's hard to seize Russian oligarch assets if you don't know who owns what. Washington Post reported on March 16th that finding yachts and mansions is easier than uncovering money in private equity funds that don't need to comply with the same anti-corruption rules. U.S. private equity, hedge funds, venture capitals are not currently required to disclose beneficial ownership information of their investors to FinCEN, nor are they required to provide that information to the SEC. In February, the House passed the Competes Act, which included an amendment that I authored requiring the issuers of large issuances of exempt securities to file beneficial ownership with the SEC. We do need to know about this $11 trillion of private securities market if we're going to know what's owned by which government agencies in Moscow or which Russian oligarchs. Congresswoman Maloney's Corporate Transparency Act now requires Treasury to establish a federal beneficial ownership database administered by FinCEN. Madam Secretary, can you give us information on the time frame where we expect this database to be set up?
So let me say on the FinCEN, we are working very hard to establish that database as rapidly as possible and have come out with one of the two proposed rules that we need. It's a very complex undertaking. We want to get it right. I want to respond on the issue about private equity firms and hedge funds, that we share the concerns of members of Congress who have raised this issue, and we're actively considering a rule that would address potential gaps in the AML-CFT coverage for investment advisors, and do believe that this is something that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. It may just have to respond for the record, but we now have a climate counselor in the administration to coordinate a broad range of work regarding climate-related finance, economic, and tax policy. I hope you could provide us with an update on Treasury's efforts to coordinate with our international partners.
Be happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Secretary. It's so good to have you back before the committee, and I appreciate my colleagues discussing at length the role of the special drawing rights issues that you and I have talked about several times, but I think it does merit noting that the $17.5 billion in equivalent of SDRs that were issued last summer by the IMF to Russia boosted their total SDR balance by just 72%, meaning that was the largest portion of their SDRs are from last year's allocation. And it's really their gold and their SDRs that, in my view, are still subject to the ability to avoid sanctions. I think it's a real risk, and that's why I'm also glad that Chair Waters, we marked up H.R. 6899 that encourages you as our Treasury Secretary to make sure that the U.S. works very hard to make sure that Russia and Belarus cannot in any way exchange their SDRs. So thank you for that work. So I want to follow up, though, on our conversation we had last summer. You made some commitments to the committee and to the public about the enhanced rules that the IMF would do about that SDR issuance. You told us in March last year, we're working with the IMF to craft rules that will make transparency, make it difficult to exchange. Did the IMF release those rules?
So the IMF has given countries guidelines about appropriate use of SDRs, and there is a disclosure framework so that we can monitor how they are being used. I don't quite know where you can access those, but I know that they have been produced.
I think it'd be useful for the committee to have that access to those guidelines. And do you know if any SDRs were exchanged since they were issued for payment in any form of debt?
So I can't give you a detailed rundown, but I can tell you that the United States...
Now, I know the United States isn't doing it. This isn't the question. This is in your capacity of overseeing our role as the largest shareholders in the IMF. I know that the U.S. is in good standing here. But one of the concerns last year was you couldn't obtain that commitment from anybody. And we didn't ask anybody to commit to it in advance of it being issued. So we have not seen that guidance. We don't know what those transactions have taken place, if any, over the past year. So I think that would be very helpful.
We'll try to work with you on that.
Thank you very much. And this is all why I introduced H.R. 1568, the Special Drawing Rights Oversight Act, which would do the following. Would require congressional approval for all allocations of SDRs equal to 25% of the U.S. quota rather than the 100% under current law. Limit unilateral allocations to once every 10 years rather than every 5 years, and requiring congressional consultations 180 days before consenting to an allocation rather than 90. We don't need to reiterate how much we've, I think, demonstrated that last year's SDR issue across the board to all members of the IMF was a mistake, as noted by Ranking Member McHenry. On the subject of FinCEN, do you believe that FinCEN should have the nationwide authority to review any transaction of any amount on any subject out in the financial space over $10,000? In other words, expand the geographic targeting that they do to a nationwide audience. Do you think that's appropriate?
So I'm not sure. I need to get back to you on that. I know that FinCEN has some concerns with geographic coverage because of the prevalence of internet transactions, and would like to see some changes.
I'd like to hear your personal view on that, because with no limitations, that would mean every transaction over $10,000 would be subject to review by a FinCEN staff and added to a database. That seems unusual to me and perhaps not prudent, so I'd like your personal view on that. The last subject I wanted to raise with you is we've all expressed some concerns, including the chairwoman, about the performance of our managing director at the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. And I have concerns about her qualifications. Do you share those concerns? Do you have all the faith in the world in her leadership at the IMF?
Believe that she's done a good job of guiding the IMF. We have been very supportive of the work that the World Bank did to look into the World Bank's Doing Business report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to send to our Oversight Committee, Madam Chair, a letter requesting an investigation to the Director of the IMF. Thank you.
Well, without objection, such is the order. Thank you. We will now hear from the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, good to see you.
Thank you.
I want to give you the state of play of safe banking, which is the cannabis and banking. And you and I have had many conversations about this. But I want you to understand where it is and to put the muscle of the administration behind getting it passed. So we've passed it now out of the House 6 times. Most recently, it was amended onto the America Competes Act. The way we've passed it has been with sizable bipartisan majorities. When it was a standalone, we passed it 321 to 101. But it seems to get...
Got somebody else above me, so I might be next, but I got 4 minutes.
Hey, Al, you need to mute.
I think he's going to suggest maybe doing something like a buffet.
So gets to the Senate and gets stuck. And when Senator Crapo chaired the committee, basically from the Republicans' point of view, too big, too broad. Now Senator Brown is the chair of the committee, too limited, too narrow. But we know that people are still getting killed and robbed. And most recently, Seattle Times did an editorial last week because 3 people were killed in Seattle last week. A robber, a police officer, and an owner of a dispensary because of all the cash. Oakland, California, in November, there were 25 armed robberies in 1 week. And we had a young woman speak with us who was one of those who was robbed. And then she got robbed again last week. Small businesses, minority-owned businesses need access to capital, which they would get if the banking system were open to them. So I was speaking to the national bank supervisors last week, and I said to them, this isn't Ukraine. This issue isn't Ukraine. This issue isn't nuclear winter. This issue isn't climate change, but it's a real problem. And they said, yeah, you're sent there to solve problems, and they expect this problem to be solved. I'd like to just get your sentiment on this subject, since you and I have talked about it for a very long time.
We have talked about it for a very long time, and I agree with you. It's an important issue, and it's extremely frustrating one that we haven't been able to resolve it. I really appreciate your leadership in this area. We have worked with you on this bill. We're supportive of it. As you know, there's a conflict between state and national law. Banks are trapped in the middle of that, and some legislative solution, I think, is necessary to move this forward. I share your frustration that we haven't been able to make progress. I think it does really require congressional action.
Well, and I thank you for that. And I guess I just ask you to impress upon the administration the need to either get it passed as part of the American Competes Act, which I think will be coming up the quickest, so that nobody else dies because there's so much cash, or stand alone, but get it out of the Senate and get it to the president. So
we would like to see that happen.
Thank you very much. I will switch to Ukraine now for a second. You know, one of the things that we've seen, President Biden's brought together all sorts of nations to deal with sanctions on Russia and in response to the invasion. But however, Russia's been preparing for this moment for some time, and Putin has been attempting to sanction-proof his economy. What should we make of the Russian ruble's recovery from the free fall it saw in early March? And is this a sign that the Russian economy is more resilient than we originally thought?
The Russian economy is really reeling from the sanctions that we put in place. And the market in rubles is not a free market where the value that's established in trading reflects the value if the currency would have if it could be freely traded. Russians aren't allowed to sell assets. Foreigners who own Russian assets are not allowed to sell rubles and take their money from the country. There are capital controls in place, and the restrictions that Russia and the Russian Central Bank have put on Russians leads to a situation in which you shouldn't really infer anything from the value of the currency.
Thank you for your service, and my time has expired.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Laudermilk, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here today. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the implementation of the anti-money laundering and beneficial ownership reform law that I know that you're working on right now. And the new rules from FinCEN really will require regular reporting of beneficial ownership from about 30 million businesses, along with about 2 million new businesses per year. Now, the vast majority of these businesses, are law-abiding, and their focus is on serving their customers, making payroll. They're law-abiding businesses, but they don't stay tuned in to what's going on here on Capitol Hill. They're not watching the C-SPAN coverage of this today. They're just there trying to make a living. And so I see that it's going to be a real challenge to make sure they're aware of these new rules. Now, we don't want this to become a gotcha enforcement mechanism that's used by, unfortunately, too many agencies now as punishment for someone who just isn't aware that they have to give up this type of information. And quite frankly, most of them are small businesses. So my question is, what's your plan to work with state governments to make sure that small businesses are aware of the requirements and so they'll know how they have to comply?
Well, I think you raised an important point, that it is important to be in touch with these businesses. I can't tell you in detail what the plan is, but I'd be glad to have people at Treasury discuss this with you and offer a briefing and have a chance to hear your concerns and suggestions.
Well, I think it's going to be imperative for us to have a plan going in because, we, as I said, it doesn't It should not turn into a gotcha enforcement mechanism to where a guy that runs a small carpentry shop who is more focused on the price he's paying for lumber and sheetrock, et cetera, he's trying to keep his businesses going, all of a sudden gets a knock on the door from a federal agent that says, you've never told us who you are and your ownership. I don't believe that is, I hope that isn't the direction that we're going, but I don't know. I think there needs to be a plan going forward, and that Congress is aware of the plan of how we are going to let these businesses know of the requirements that have been put on them by Congress and by the federal government to comply with this new law. And so I think there definitely should be a plan moving forward, because this is most of these businesses, they don't have floors of compliance lawyers. They don't even have a lawyer. You know, they're just trying to get by. So I also think that there's a concern with many of us that the proposed rules definitions of substantial control and ownership interests are overly complicated. I think this is it's going to make it hard to apply them consistently across the board, especially with various size businesses. And it's going to compound the problem for banks and credit unions if FinCEN uses those same definitions in an updated customer due diligence rule. So as a follow-on question, will Treasury and FinCEN take steps to try to simplify these aspects of the rule before it's finalized?
So, you know, FinCEN has put out a proposed rule to collect the information, and it does wish to minimize the burden on entities that are required to report it. So there have been very significant public comments on the rule, and FinCEN will consider them very carefully, you know, before trying to finalize a rule in this area. So this is a very legitimate concern, and one that FinCEN needs to carefully work on.
If I'm not mistaken, FinCEN is technically a part of the Department of Treasury. Is that correct?
Yes.
Of which you are at the captain of the helm. So, I mean, it sounds a little bit like you're deferring them to be an independent agency over here, but they do answer to you. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so what I'm asking is, are you going to give direction in these areas to simplify substantial control and ownership interest, or make it such that this doesn't turn into an issue where we find potentially millions of businesses not in compliance with the law and wondering where they're going to go? I mean, looking for some type of direction. I'm not hearing there's a plan, and I'm not hearing that this is the way we're going, just kind of hoping that's the way we go.
Well, I agree that this is a very legitimate concern that needs to be addressed, and we will address it.
All right, thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for having this hearing. Secretary Yellen, I'm hearing from some small CDFIs that they are concerned that proposed changes being made by the CFDI fund will make it harder to become certified as a CDFI and access the important capital that Congress has been providing. This is especially troubling coming out of a pandemic. Can I get a commitment from you today that we will look into this and make sure that the administration and the CFDI's funds will not make changes to the certification process for community institutions to become CDFIs more difficult?
So we'd be happy to discuss this in greater detail with you. I'm not sure I exactly understand what the issue is, but I can have my staff contact you and learn more. We're certainly very supportive of CDFIs and want to make sure that they can become established and receive all of the additional funding that Congress has made available. These are critical institutions in supporting the provision of capital, especially in low-income minority neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you, and I look forward to receiving that information. Secretary Yellen, I'm hearing from those representing credit unions as when they apply for CDFIs funds, some are waiting over 6 months for a status update on decision on their certification as a CDI. Can you look into it, what may be causing the delay in getting timely updates and decision, and let us know if this is something that needs statutory relief from Congress, or are there other ways that this can be addressed?
We'll be glad to work with you on that and have a look.
Okay. Secretary Yellen, with the creation of the interagency law enforcement team, how is it the information that treasurers collect being shared with the task force, and have you found the creation of the task force useful?
I'm sorry, the task force on what? I didn't quite catch that.
I'm saying, have you found the task force being useful?
Which task force?
To capture, well, I'll tell you what, I said with the creation of the intelligence law enforcement team.
I'm sorry, are you referring to Klepto Task Force?
Yeah, have you found that information to be useful?
I'm not sure.
The Klepto Capture Task Force. Is that it?
Yes.
This was just recently established by the Department of Justice to help us go after oligarchs, to make sure that we're able to identify and seize their property. And I think they've already had notable success in seizing some property, and it's going to be an important initiative in helping us make sure that sanctions work.
Okay. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Yellen, a recent study on Chinese lending by Aid Data revealed that China has established itself as the lender of first resort for many low-income and middle-income countries. China's lending terms are often less generous than those of Western and multilateral creditors, yet the multilateral development banks are not appealing enough to these countries, and they in turn turn to loans from China. China has financed hundreds of billions of dollars in development projects around the world in the last 20 years. China is not extending their funds to these countries out of kindness. They are using their financing to aggressively expand their influence around the world. So my question is, why is it that so many countries take a Chinese loan when financing from multilateral development banks is available, and what are you doing to change this?
So my sense is that many developing countries would much prefer high standards, capacity building, MDB loans to Chinese loans, and it's not that they prefer Chinese borrowing to MDB borrowing, but that they really want to have access to all the financing that's available to them, and they use both. We feel very strongly, and this is part of the commitment of the President made to B3W, Build Back Better World, to helping developing countries build infrastructure in ways that involve sustainable debt, transparency, high-quality lending practices, rather than Chinese, often predatory lending practices. And I think, to make sure that we have that capacity, we need to bolster U.S. leadership in the multilateral system, and to make sure that we meet our financial obligations to these institutions. So they need to be adequately resourced, and we don't yet have confirmed executive directors, which is also important.
Okay, thank you for your response to that question. As a lead into my second question, I'd like to use our current situation with Russia as a good example of why China's influence abroad is an important issue, very important issue. In response to its aggression in the Ukraine, America responded with sanctions that will isolate and weaken Russia. Such a response does not work if we act alone. We need other countries to join our effort in order to apply more pressure to Vladimir Putin and Russia. So my concern is that with China's growing influence abroad, it would be more difficult to isolate and weaken them in the case of a Chinese military aggression. So Secretary Yellen, how concerned are you that China's lending around the world could interrupt attempts to respond to Chinese aggression?
Well, I mean, I would say generally I am concerned about Chinese lending around the world. I think, as I mentioned, I think often Chinese lending can be predatory and result in unsustainable debt and influence on countries, and that I would very much like to see the United States and its partners expand our lending in ways that diminished China's influence in this space. And of course, it is a way in which China exerts influence on many countries that borrow from it. But we need an alternative, and we need to finance it, and need a response.
Thank you. I think in my last minute I have time for one more question. The Chinese Communist Party is carrying out what is widely acknowledged as genocide of the Uyghurs, and yet only one member of the Politburo has been sanctioned pursuant to the Global Magnitsky Act, and that individual was sanctioned during the Trump administration. Why aren't we sanctioning China's top leadership for what they're doing to the Uyghurs?
Well, you know, we have put on sanctions of individuals who are involved in Xinjiang and the Uyghur situation. Who exactly to sanction in China is something that's part of broader foreign policy concerns that State Department plays an important role in determining, is not just a matter for Treasury.
Thank you. I'd just like to close by saying we need to act quickly to stop China's negative influence from growing further. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for joining us today. The U.S. faces an increasingly complex series of challenges before it. Between the Russian invasion of Ukraine, competition with China, and the continued threat of both homegrown and domestic terrorism, it is critical that Congress work together in a bipartisan manner to address these issues. The world is watching our response to these critical issues before us, and it is imperative we act together to demonstrate leadership in such areas as stopping the financing of terrorists and ensuring the U.S. emerges as a leader in emerging technologies. Secretary Yellen, the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness just released its 2022 terrorism threat assessment. The report cited homegrown violent extremists, such as those inspired by ISIS and other extremists, as the top terrorist threat facing New Jersey citizens. What is the Treasury Department doing to combat the financing of domestic terrorists, whether the funding comes from overseas or from U.S. sources? And is this a major concern for you and your work?
Yes, it certainly is a major concern, and we're using sanctions policy and other resources to try to address this threat.
Can you speak a little bit about, if you would, where you see gaps now that you've been in the job for a bit, where you see gaps in your authority, which we could help address here in Congress? What would be most helpful for you to help fight these threats to our country?
So, you know, generally, we have great powers to impose sanctions and to use them under president's executive orders to address threats that we see. There may be some discrete areas. I think one came up earlier in this hearing about geographical targeting in the case of FinCEN's collection abilities, but we can work with you and give you greater detail on areas where it might be possible to have our authority bolstered. But in general, we have substantial powers in these areas.
Thank you, and I look forward to working with you on that. If I can move on, I've been a strong supporter of establishing appropriate guardrails around the cryptocurrency space that will both protect consumers and encourage innovation here in the United States. This includes my discussion draft, the Stablecoin Innovation and Protection Act, which would establish guidelines on issuing qualified stablecoins. One area I'm particularly concerned about is ensuring that bad actors are not able to use cryptocurrency of any kind to launder money or fund nefarious activities. Can you talk a little bit about efforts Treasury is taking to ensure actors like terrorists or Russian oligarchs are to prevent them from using crypto and avoid sanctions regimes?
Yes.
I know you talked about this a little. If you can expand on that, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, we are aware of the possibility clearly that crypto could be used as a tool to evade sanctions, and we're carefully monitoring to make sure that that doesn't occur. But I would say we have a good deal of authority in this area and are using it and will use it. And it's harder on a large scale for an economy to actually use crypto to evade sanctions. Large-scale transactions would become apparent by those who regularly examine the blockchain. We would see that there were large transactions taking place. Exchanges, those who use crypto need to get in and out of it to buy things in hard currencies, and exchanges are subject to AML, CFT regulations, so they're part of the financial system that is subject to those regulations. And trying to use crypto on a large scale simply, we think, is something that is not easy to do. So it is a channel we're worried about. We haven't seen significant evasion through crypto so far, but we'll monitor carefully and use our authorities that we do have to make sure that this isn't a major avenue for evasion.
On the crypto space, you might imagine I'm hearing from, like many members of Congress, from those in the space, both consumer groups, but also, of course, entrepreneurs and businesses that are developing in cryptocurrency. I guess I'm out of time. I will yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Madam Secretary, thank you. Appreciate your testimony today. And I'm just curious, do you believe that pursuing globalization through executive policies are aligned with our goals of promoting an internationally competitive environment through domestic policy?
I'm sorry, promoting globalization?
Globalization.
Through what?
Well, I mean, did we sign a treaty or something with Basel? Is there some sort of U.S. Did I miss something that the Senate, affirmed a U.S. treaty with some of this international global framework? And the reason I ask, just one of the most recent examples is this global minimum tax imposed under OECD Pillar 2, and it says it would protect national sovereignty. Your rationale seems perplexing, because I'm not sure anyone would think that sovereignty is derived from some sort of international agreement, particularly on tax policy. And, of course, in our Constitution, it says all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. And so, what's the logic of submitting to some non-sovereign international framework on tax policy?
Any change in tax law in the United States must be legislated by Congress without question. So there is no agreement that imposes any requements on
So just a coordination, kind of like Basel isn't binding, but we do implement it and kind of gold plate it, for example. Not to conflate Basel with tax policy, but when you talk about bank regulation, prudential regulation, some of the components that are allegedly in these stress tests that even Congress isn't allowed access to, and the people submitting to them aren't allowed to, share the results of those, even to Congress, who wants to determine whether we have the right regulatory framework in there. A lot of this is coming out of this global cooperation. So what's the nature of that?
Well, look, we have a global financial system, and for it to be regulated effectively, regulatory systems across countries need to be coordinated with one another. And supervisors are all asking themselves what's the best way to proceed to have a safe, sound
I think my point is that it is not a binding treaty of the United States, and it's not a power that Congress delegated that we shouldn't be able to hear candid answers. And so there are big black holes in terms of what we're able to get from this. And I just want to follow up on one area in particular, because I think you're saying something that's encouraging here. So in December, you submitted answers to Senator Toomey in response to questions that he submitted for the record. One question pertained to draft guidance issued by the Financial Action Task Force. A particular question asked if Treasury believed in non-custodial services should be subjected to money service business registration in light of FATF guidance that was issued in the fall. In your answer, you stated that the FATF guidance was aligned with prior FinCEN guidance and that neither approach proposed to regulate the technology itself. Rather, you asserted that both FATF and FinCEN guidance were focused on financial activity. Do you still stand by that statement?
I believe so. I don't know if you have something particular in mind that goes against that, but
well, I don't. I think that my concern is picking up on that FinCEN guidance. For example, we introduced a bill called "Keep Your Coins," which protects self-custody, and the reason we feel the need to protect it is because Treasury under Secretary Mnuchin and at points under your leadership have proposed to enter into rulemaking on that would potentially prohibit self-custody, or as the language has been used, self-hosted wallets. But it's really self-custody of private property without an intermediary. And I guess I wonder, I was really encouraged by your dialogue with Mr. Gottheimer there in terms of your view on some of the digital asset space. And I know that you have a speech coming up on that, I think, tomorrow. But in light of the President's executive order, do you believe that it would be fitting for Treasury or other components of Treasury, such as the SEC, to enter into rulemaking while we're in the midst of that executive order?
To enter into a rulemaking?
Rulemaking, speeches, statements of policy or guidance. Should we take those kinds of things as guidance or what, in light of the executive order?
So the President has issued an executive order asking his government to examine issues connected with digital assets. I'm giving a speech tomorrow to describe the executive order and the approach that we're taking, but in most areas we haven't come out yet with recommendations. An exception to that is in the area of stable coins, where I believe my undersecretary testified to you the President's working group is sufficiently concerned about rapid growth that we did come out with recommendations there.
Thank you, and I hope Congress will participate fully, and my time's expired. I yield.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary Yellen. I'd like to understand a little bit about the energy sanctions that we have on Russia and the potential sanctions that we could impose. And I'm delighted to see that there seems to be some strong bipartisan support for sanctioning Russia's oil exports. If I'm doing my math right, Russia exported about 4.7 million barrels a day last year. They're about the second largest producer, 11 million barrels per day of production, and somewhere between 4 and 5.
I believe they produce about 10 or 11 million barrels a day.
Total production, but the exports are between 4 and 5. So
something like that.
That yes. Ballpark. So, we are, of course, a very small take of that import. So what I'd like to understand is that as we're thinking with our NATO allies and others about sanctioning of that, let's call it 5, how much realistically can we block from the sale in international markets? Can we get the whole 5? Can we get half of that? Like, what do we think is the amount of pain we could impose on Russia by blocking those exports?
Well, I mean, the United States has banned oil imports.
Sure, but we're like 500,000 barrels a day. Like,
I mean, the issue with blocking oil exports from Russia is that many countries, especially in Europe, are very dependent on that oil, and we're likely to see skyrocketing prices if we did put a complete ban on oil. And as I said at the outset, our concern has been in designing sanctions. We want to impose the maximum pain we can on Russia, but also taking care not to impose undue pain on Americans or on our partners. So we all realize we wish we were a lot less dependent.
And I'm sympathetic to that, and I'm not trying to ask a politically leading question. I'm just trying to understand. We do have, and I realize natural gas is a bit of a different issue with Germany's situation, but with respect to oil, I mean, I've seen ranges of 1 to 3 million barrels a day that the civilized world could block, and I'm trying to understand, because there's a big supply-demand balance question on the other side, and I'm wondering, as we think both about the tools we have to block Russia and the global inflationary measures, I don't know how to think about that except in saying how many million barrels a day are we going to take off the market?
So to the extent that we diminish Russia's ability to export oil and force Russia to keep oil in the ground, which is occurring to a meaningful extent right now, we do want to worry about overall supplies and making sure that they're at least roughly adequate. I mean, that's why President Biden announced a major release of 1 million barrels a day of crude from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over the next 6 months, in the hope that an expectation that high prices will induce firms in the United States and elsewhere. It's enough time to ramp up production. If we're successful with that, it might be possible to put tougher restrictions on Russia.
Okay, well, maybe we can follow up offline, because I don't. The concern I have is that if we're looking at 1 to 3 million barrels a day of shutdown, there's no country that has the ability to ramp that up. And of course, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is a finite resource. And I think we have a lot of things we could do on the demand side, of course, right? I mean, I'm delighted to see the move on heat pumps and things we could do to lower oil use. But I'm nervous about what's there. And I would like us to understand, if we, on a bipartisan basis, as we should be, are committed to reducing Russian oil exports, then we need to have a really good visibility on what that does to global prices for oil markets, and to what degree can we reduce our dependency on those through other measures.
Right. Well, the demand for oil is highly inelastic in the short run, and so
as is the supply.
Too large a restriction on supply could have very large price effects, and that's what we're trying to balance. That we would ideally like to impose as much pain as possible on Russia, but we need to take account of the consequences.
I'm out of time, but I'll send you a question for the record. I've really got the same question about food. That if I look at wheat production and corn production and sunflower oil production, there's the same dynamics there, and I'd like us to understand how we hurt Russia and understand the
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the Chair, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here today. So considering that one of the topics of discussion today is our effort to counter terrorist financing, I'd like to discuss the fact that the U.S. government has already sent taxpayer money to convicted terrorists. So I sent you a letter on January 11th regarding the revelation that the convicted Boston Marathon bomber had received a $1,400 economic impact payment under President Biden's American Rescue Plan. Now, this was revealed in court filings in the state of Massachusetts. So for background, this is a man who planted a bomb at the 2013 Boston Marathon that killed 3 people, including an 8-year-old boy, and he maimed dozens more, and he then went on to murder an MIT police officer. So now, as of July 2021, the IRS found that 560,000 incarcerated individuals received stimulus checks, and that totaled $783 million. So, Madam Secretary, my first question is this. Can you provide an updated number on how many incarcerated individuals received stimulus checks from President Biden's American Rescue Plan?
Sorry, I don't have that number at my fingertips. I believe that the law required it. This wasn't a matter of IRS discretion. I believe the IRS followed the law.
Thank you. I want to shift gears just a minute. So can you, rather than how many individuals, can you now provide an updated amount of federal tax dollars that were sent to federal prisoners?
I don't have that. I don't have that for you, but this wasn't a discretionary decision by the IRS.
So from what we know, at least $783 million in taxpayer funds have been sent to federal prisoners. And that includes murderers, rapists, and terrorists. So, Madam Secretary, does the Biden administration believe it's acceptable that hundreds of millions of dollars, $750 million, taxpayer money, do you think it's okay with the Biden administration that goes to federal prisoners?
The IRS is carrying out the law, and this is a law that Congress passed.
Well, it's very interesting, and I have the yeas and nays here from a March 6th of 2021. It was a Cassidy Amendment, 1162 on the Senate side. And we actually offered it was an amendment over there to block federal money, taxpayer dollars, from going to prisoners. But every single Senate Democrat last year blocked that amendment to the American Rescue Plan that would have prevented these payments to prisoners. So we see that the Biden administration didn't support that. But does the Biden administration support sending taxpayer money to federal prisoners, like the Boston bomber in particular?
Look, as I said, Treasury is charged with carrying out programs that Congress passes, and that's what we're doing. And I don't have an opinion to share with you beyond
I understand that, but it seems
we're implementing a law that Congress passed.
I mean, I'm just as confounded as it seems you are at this, because with the majority in the Senate side, they had the authority to stop it but did not. Or if they didn't have the authority, why did they support the amendment that would have given you the authority to send that? The Biden administration, it just seems, was very irresponsible with this, because they could have prevented this, and yet they did not. So I just want to be very clear with you, Madam Secretary. I do not think that federal prisoners should be getting stimulus checks, period. Every taxpayer dollar is sacred and should be treated that way. So I strongly urge your department to do better when it comes to safeguarding taxpayer dollars. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Iowa, Mrs. Axney, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for being here. It's good to see you today. And I want to start out by thanking you so much for helping the great state of Iowa get the funds that we needed transferred from the state over to Polk County to keep a roof over people's head, and how quickly the Treasury Department responded to the request from me and the state to make that happen. It's made a big difference, and I really appreciate it. Again, I'd also like to thank you as well for yesterday's event where the president signed the executive order, and for helping us address that family glitch so that a couple 100,000 more Americans can get health care coverage, and we can lower the cost for others. In states like Iowa, that means a world of difference. So thank you so much for all you do.
Thank you for that. We were glad to be able to address that.
Wonderful. Well, here's the deal. I know a lot of people, and you're hearing it today, are very interested in how the sanctions are working against Russia. I've heard from multiple folks and in briefings, et cetera, that the sanctions seem to be working well. But as that is basically one of our key tools that we're using right now in this issue, I'd like to hear more from you if you think that those sanctions are working in the way they should, and if they're strengthening what we have in place, and if there's any suggestions that you also have.
So I do believe the sanctions are having a devastating effect on Russia. Russia's become almost completely isolated from the international financial system. It's finding it extremely, American and foreign firms are leaving Russia. It's losing access to goods that Russians are accustomed to buying and being deprived of. The Central Bank of Russia had amassed a war chest of reserves of over $600 billion that they counted on to be able to deal with the impacts of sanctions on their economy and to help financial institutions and firms that were badly affected. And our sanctions on the central bank, jointly with our partners, have deprived them of access to it. Certainly over half of that, and another 30 or 35% is tied up in gold and other forms of wealth that are not highly liquid. So we have really deprived them of access to a war chest that they were counting on. We have imposed restrictions on exports of a wide range of equipment that's including semiconductors that are critical to Russia's ability to continue to build defense and high technology sectors. We have sanctioned hundreds of Russian oligarchs and members of the Russian government. We've sanctioned firms in the defense sector, in the aerospace sector, and we continue to work with our allies to put in place additional sanctions as Putin ramps up his horrific crimes in the Ukraine. Just this morning, we announced that we're putting in place full blocking sanctions against Russia's largest bank that has over a third of the assets of the Russian banking system. We're prohibiting Americans from investing in Russia and further sanctioning elites. And this is, I believe, going to have a devastating effect on the economy and already is doing so. So, every week we have put in place new sanctions, working as closely to coordinate with our partners. We have a huge coalition. Countries that have rarely, if ever, imposed sanctions, including Switzerland and Singapore, have joined with our coalition, and I do believe that they're working.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen. That was a great overview. I did want to talk about supply chain because of the lockdown in China. I might ask you right over to your office. I'm running out of time, but I appreciate all the work you're doing and the update on the sanctions.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for calling today's hearing, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for being here today. One thing I hear from constituents at home, and I think every other member of Congress hears from their constituents, is everything is expensive. It's just expensive to live today. And there are a lot of factors for inflation. I get that. I do want to ask you, going back to the American Rescue Plan, before we voted on it, Larry Summers, one of your predecessors under Clinton, talked about the package, and he said, I'm quoting, he said, I think this is the least responsible macroeconomic policy that we've had in the last 40 years. He's right, isn't he, Madam Secretary?
Well, he's not right, and I'm sorry I have to differ with his assessment. You have an American economy that is enjoying the strongest job market that we have had in decades. Americans feel confident of their ability to get jobs and to move to better jobs. To think that a year, 2 years after a pandemic struck our country and unemployment was in the double digits, rather than waiting for a decade as we had to after the financial crisis to recover the jobs that we lost. This country is enjoying a 3.6% unemployment rate and has seen the creation of over 500,000 jobs a month in recent months. Americans' financial conditions overall are very strong. If you ask the largest banks in the country that keep track of checking account balances of their customers at all levels of income and
Let me
wealth.
reclaim my time, Madam Secretary. To put you on the record, you're saying that people feel good about the economy today. The American people feel good about the economy.
Well, they're concerned about inflation, and that's entirely understandable. And I'm concerned about it.
Because they're seeing the highest inflation that
administration.
they've seen in 40 years, correct?
Yes, it is. And
Let me ask you about this.
It is a
Yesterday,
significant
San Francisco
problem that must be
Fed
dealt.
President Mary Daly was speaking. She was talking about inflation at a 40-year high. She said about that that's as harmful as not having a job. She's right about that, isn't she?
Well, of course, it erodes the ability of households to purchase a wide array of goods and services. So yes, it is. But remember that especially for the lowest income Americans, wage increases have been more rapid than inflation. And for pensioners, Social Security
Reclaiming my time,
recipients,
the wages are not keeping up with everyday goods and services, correct?
For low-income Americans, on
For every
average, that is not true. For low-income Americans, their wage gains have exceeded that.
How about for middle-class Americans? Are wage gains exceeding the price increases, or are price increases exceeding wage gains for middle-class Americans?
Well, over the last year, the price increases have exceeded the wage gains
Thank you.
for middle.
Let me ask you about sanctions in my remaining time. A big priority of Chairwoman Waters has been sanctions against the Russian oligarchs. I think of everybody, and we applaud those efforts. As it relates to President Putin, what degree of confidence do you have that any of these sanctions that we've levied have personally touched him or his assets?
We have levied sanctions against President Putin, and this morning, I believe, we levied sanctions against his daughters. Look, did it deter? Did all the sanctions, including those that we've imposed against him, and the threat that we told him that we would make this very painful and impose sanctions greater than anything any country had ever seen?
Let me ask it another way. Is he feeling the effect of the sanctions? Is President Putin feeling the effects of the sanctions? Do we have any?
Is he what?
Is President Putin feeling the effects of the United States sanctions that have been assessed against him?
I don't know personally if he's feeling them yet, but Russia is certainly feeling the effects of these sanctions, and his defense establishment and other critical sectors of the Russian economy are absolutely feeling the effects of these sanctions, as they find it impossible, for example, to find the parts that they need to keep their automobile factories running and to build their war machine and replenish it.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Maloney, who is also the chair of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Waters, and thank you so much for being here, Secretary Yellen. As you know, I'm very focused on Treasury's implementation of my Corporate Transparency Act, which will require companies to disclose their true beneficial ownership to FinCEN. This was the most important up-to-date anti-money laundering laws in a generation, and I believe this should be a top priority of the Treasury Department. The law gave Treasury 1 year to finalize the rules implementing the bill, and that deadline was over 3 months ago. So far, Treasury has not finalized any part of the rule and has only proposed half of it. This is deeply disappointing, especially because the sanctions on Russian oligarchs have shown the importance of being able to look behind anonymous shell companies to find these bad actors. And as we speak, Russian oligarchs are busy moving their money out of our reach, and in some cases, they're likely moving their money into the U.S. because they know they can hide it anywhere they want anonymously until Treasury finally finishes implementing my bill. This is not about Treasury having insufficient resources either. I have worked with Chairwoman Waters and my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee to secure an additional $355 million for Treasury and FinCEN, which is more than enough to write the rule. The second half of the rule, which Treasury hasn't even proposed yet, is the most important part because it deals with who has access to the beneficial ownership database and on what terms. So, Secretary Yellen, will you commit to proposing the access rule for the Corporate Transparency Act before the end of the month?
I can't give you a definite promise on timing. These are extremely complex rules. There are relationships between the two parts of the rule, and they have to be coordinated. Treasury has received very extensive comments on the first part of the rule that it has to consider in preparing the second part of the rule. They're not fully separable. So this is tremendously important legislation. I congratulate you and Congress for passing this. It is a critically important effort. It's very complex. We have to get this right. I can't agree to a deadline. I'm not positive when we're going to get that.
I'll tell you, it is critically important, especially what's happening in the world with Ukraine. And if you can't commit to the end of the month, when will you be proposing the access rule? Can you give us an estimate for when we will be able to see this rule?
Well, certainly this year, within the coming months.
Well, Secretary Yellen, my message to you today is a very simple one. Please speed up the process for the beneficial ownership rulemaking. This is taking far too long, and we need action now, not in a few months, but now. We don't know who's behind buildings in New York and elsewhere, which are just bank accounts. There are no lights in the buildings. People don't live there. They're anonymous shell companies. And law enforcement wants to know, the public wants to know, the Ukrainian people want to know who owns this property, and we can't get to it until the rules have been made, and we are way, way behind, and it is an emergency. Now I'd like to move on to the substance of the rule. There are a number of things Treasury could do in the access rule to make the beneficial ownership database more usable and more effective for the law enforcement and others. For example, making the forms that companies fill out very clear and easy to understand, and having companies submit the information on machine-readable format. Open Ownership, which is an international nonprofit that focuses on beneficial ownership, has a number of additional recommendations for Treasury's database. Secretary Yellen, what is Treasury doing to ensure that the beneficial ownership database is as usable and effective as possible for the users of the database?
It's been a key consideration since the outset, and be glad to give you a briefing on what FinCEN is doing on that front.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here today. I want to jump right into some China, World Bank, debt trap diplomacy questions, if I could. So when we think about the developing world and how we can help them develop their economies responsibly and sustainably, In many instances, countries in the developing world are choosing between different financing packages. Way too often, they're choosing China and the usurious terms that come along with that. So from a tools standpoint, what do we need either at the IFIs or the DFC to have more competitive offerings for the developing world so that they're choosing our packages over China's? And or are we even at the table when these conversations are taking place?
So I think we need the multilateral development banks to be adequately financed so they have the capacity to offer sufficient financing. There's an enormous need for infrastructure investment throughout the developing world. Countries are starved for the resources, and many don't have access to private capital markets.
So just to interrupt quickly, is your contention that these banks are not funded appropriately, like the World Bank, IMF, they do not have adequate capital to make competitive offerings? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, in some cases they are adequately funded. In other cases, there probably is a need for additional resources. We ourselves are in arrears, substantial arrears, in terms of meeting our own commitments and in terms of trying to generate new commitments. For example, we feel very strongly that the IMF's new Resilience and Sustainability Trust can make an important contribution to energy security and to pandemic preparedness, and Congress hasn't given us the authority to lend money to that. If the United States lends, we believe it could catalyze $100 billion from a group of countries.
Got it. And one of the problems I have with, not one of the problems, one of the issues I've been working on since I got here is Chinese influence at the IFIs, in particular the World Bank, where when I've spoken to previous executive directors of both parties, what you hear is often China has essentially bought their influence, or they've more or less bought their votes in various ways, and it makes it very difficult to defeat anything that China wants. And as a response, one of the things that I introduced and got signed into law was the Accountability for World Bank Loans to China Act. This law has various reporting requirements, but also requires the Treasury Department to advocate for a prompt end to World Bank loans to China. China historically blocks that. According to Treasury, there's been low progress on this front. Why has there been low progress, and what should we do? Well, actually, second question, do you personally believe China should graduate from the loan program at the World Bank?
Do I what?
Do you personally believe China should graduate from the loan program?
Absolutely do, and we've advocated it very strongly.
Thank you. Another provision within the enacted legislation is a report to this committee on the indebtedness of countries to China through the Belt and Road, as well as the U.S. effectiveness in promoting debt transparency at IMF and World Bank. In your estimation, how effectively are we countering China's efforts to engage in debt trap diplomacy, and how transparent are they, or how have we done in terms of getting the transparency we need to report to this committee?
You know, transparency is very important. It's a focus of both the IMF and the World Bank, and they've taken steps. We all have to try to increase transparency, especially of China's lending to these countries, and we're not where we need to be on this. You know, China agreed to participate in the common framework for countries with unsustainable debt and hasn't really fully met its obligations there either, and so all of these are frustrations.
Real quickly, 20 seconds left. Just want to get you back on the record on something. You mentioned that at present there's no evidence that the cryptocurrency markets are being used in major ways by the Russians to evade sanctions or launder money related to the Ukraine crisis. Would you just reconfirm that that is what, in fact, what you said?
We've not seen major use of crypto as a way of evading sanctions. We will be on the lookout for it. It's early days, but we have not seen that yet.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The IMF surcharge policy imposes extra, often hidden fees onto countries with high levels of debt, and it's been widely denounced by development experts and civil society organizations as an unjust burden and a hindrance to our global economic recovery. Secretary Yellen, these fees are coming at the worst possible moment when countries are in the midst of a deadly global pandemic and in desperate need of humanitarian assistance and public health services. Are you worried that the IMF may be undermining the financial welfare and stability of the very places we are trying to support?
I'm supportive of the framework that includes IMF surcharges. They're part of the IMF's risk mitigation framework, and I see them as critical to protecting the IMF's resources and really making sure that they can play a critical role as a global lender of last resort. We're going to rely on the multilateral development banks and the IMF to provide more resources because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we need to make sure that the proper mechanisms are in place, and I think that these surcharges should remain in place.
Well, Secretary Yellen, respectfully, I disagree, and as do 17 other congressional colleagues who sent a letter to you urging you to reconsider in January. And so it's just in 2009, even before the pandemic struck, 64 countries spent more resources servicing foreign debts than they did on healthcare expenditures for their citizens. Okay, moving on. Given that Egypt and Armenia have vaccinated less than 50% of their population, is it fair to say that the money these countries are paying in surcharge fees would be better spent on, say, vaccinating their people or addressing poverty?
Well, clearly there are many countries that require resources, and to address the pandemic, to address downturns in their economy and the adverse impacts of the economy and of the current global situation. And the IMF and the World Bank and other MDBs are providing those resources that are very much needed. So I think this surcharge issue is separate and is a risk mitigation policy that's appropriate.
Well, I think the detrimental impacts of these fees is, and its government's abilities to effectively combat the pandemic is not really up for debate. But since you're not willing to go on record and saying that you would suspend these fees, would you at least be willing to go on record and say that you would review this surcharge policy, at least a review of it, just some consideration given the detrimental impacts?
Well, we can look at it and meet with you to discuss this issue if that would be helpful.
Absolutely. I look forward to that, and we'll follow up. Thank you, Madam Secretary. We have to do everything in our power to end the global pandemic, including eliminating surcharges. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. I would now like to thank Secretary Yellen for her testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witness to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. With that, this hearing is adjourned.